Hello, everybody. So, welcome back. This is part two of my Darling in the Franxx review. Last time I talked about the show's plot, the characters, and I kind of compared it and contrasted with others, particularly Evangelion. I'm sorry if I'm going to be talking a lot about Evangelion in this one, but it's kind of the most obvious comparison. And it's kind of like if you're talking about the new Sonic games, it's kind of logical to compare it to the Sonic Adventure games. Or if you're talking about the Star Wars reboot, it makes sense to compare it to the older Star Wars movies. So that's just kind of the most logical comparison. I'm not doing it because I think it's the only good anime ever, or it's perfect without flaws. As I said in the past, Ava has a lot of flaws that's not for everybody. That being said, let's dive into Darling in the Franxx. So I think that the show's single biggest problem, other than the end, which we'll cover in part three, is there was a lot of potential here from a thematic standpoint. And it's not just like something that was dumb that they bolted a couple pseudo deep theories on at the last minute. It was pretty prevalent throughout. It was just handled in a really bad way, and it's disappointing because a lot of this probably could have been fixed with just a little bit of dialogue here, a little bit of dialogue there, maybe some tweaking to the storyline. But they opted to not do that, and it really kind of screwed it up. So, like, to me, this show could have been an 8 or 9 out of 10, but it winds up being like a 5 or 6 out of 10. And keep in mind, five is like average. I didn't hate the show. It was just frustrating to watch because they could have done a much better job with it, and I don't think it would have been that hard. So the meme about this show is because it focuses very heavily on reproduction and and teenagers discovering their sexuality and marriage and stuff like that. The joke is that this is a show about, like, made by the Japanese government as propaganda to try to deal with Japan's falling birth rate. And I haven't done any research. Maybe that played a role in it. That's not really what I want to talk about because that's kind of the more, I suppose, obvious thing. I will say this from like a conservative reactionary standpoint. I do like that everyone gets married in this pretty much. I mean, there is the one couple that engages in degeneracy, but broadly speaking, most of the people get married and are in monogamous relationships and have children, and that's very wholesome. So let's get to what I think is kind of the main theory. Is there's kind of a very strong Gnostic element to this, and maybe Gnosticism's not the exact term because you have something very similar, and I guess maybe that's where it comes from in Gnosticism in Eastern philosophies, and you see this a lot in Japanese or Indian stuff, that there's a solicism that the reality is not the physical world. The physical world is an illusion. It's Maya. It's non-existent, and all that matters is the metaphysical. Although even then you can take that a step further and just have it that nothing is permanent, everything is completely impermanent. Once you kind of realize that and you realize nothing matters, you can accept your own oblivion. You can be free from the shackles of life and the shackles of personal identity and kind of transcend that beyond the pain of life. So I guess that at best, that kind of thinking can be. I mean, we have a certain degree of that in Christianity because obviously the body matters, obviously the pain and suffering of people in the real world matters, but ultimate salvation will come from Jesus, and ultimately the world is flawed and fallen, and it'll be made better at the end of time. That's not to say things don't matter in the meantime, but things will eventually be set right at the last day. Whereas I feel in Buddhism and Hinduism the idea is more, you don't try to fix things, you don't really wait for things to just ultimately be resolved. It's you just have to kind of loosen up and not be attached to the world. And that's the theme of a lot of anime. As you may have noticed in a lot of anime, there tends to be a theme that will is the most powerful thing in the world. That all that like if you will something to happen, if people will something to happen, it just will happen. I think that comes from the idea that reality is fundamentally an illusion. But that's a very big theme in Darling of the Franxx, is this idea of leaving the physical world behind, abandoning ties with other people, abandoning your humanity to ascend to something better, something higher. And my problem with this theme is not that it's not a good theme, because it is an interesting theme. It's just that it's done really poorly. So maybe let's just take a step back. So the backstory of the Darling in the Franxx world is humanity was, I guess, like in the near future. There might have been an energy crisis or something like that. I don't really know, but basically humanity was humanity. And then along came a group of scientists called Ape, and Ape taught humanity that there's this thing called magma energy buried within the Earth's crust, and it was like immensely powerful, and it allowed humanity to make these massive technological advancements. It allowed the plantations, which were like these giant mobile cities, obviously eventually the Franks, but most importantly, if you infused a human with magma energy, they would become immortal, but at the cost of being able to reproduce. And I think some of their emotional range, it's not very like explored very deeply. And for something that's kind of a core theme, that's kind of the issue. And so like Ape's ultimate plan was they got all of humanity to convert themselves into immortals. And so humanity didn't need reproduction anymore because they were just going to live forever. However, the process of taking the magma energy out of the earth completely destroyed the soil, water, and other resources. And so humanity goes to these big mobile cities called plantations, with the rest of the world falling into ruin, and the Klaxosaurs emerge, and what's left of humanity is in a constant battle with them. Now, the humanity that survives is a shell of its former self, and in probably the best episode of the series, we get to see what happened to the adults of humanity, where basically they live completely isolated existences. They never leave their houses. They're just hooked up to machines that stimulate the pleasure responses in their brain. They don't even really remember how to talk or interact with other people anymore. And I guess the idea is this is what humanity is using its immortality for. This is the end result of transhumanism. It's not something cool like you put your brain into a robot. It's not something cool like you colonize other planets or you delve into the secrets of creation. It's just super lame, and it's just people sitting around basically cooming. And that's a pretty interesting and good, I guess, kind of take on it, but it's just not really explored. It's not really given any context. Like it just says Ape showed up to save humanity from the burdens of the flesh. And it's like there wasn't any real context to it other than you're just supposed to, as a person, be like, life sucks. Of course, you'd want to, like, take this immortality serum that we never explain or show, and then you can. There's no context. I think, like, some very basic stuff that could have been done is maybe they could have focused more on the earth was running out of resources and people's lives had become very hard. Maybe like there was a series of resource wars like in Fallout or something like that. And Ape with their immortality serum, they could have said that humans who had received it didn't need to eat as much, and it solved the world's resource problems and brought about peace. And it was kind of salvation in a really difficult time. It kind of reminds me a bit of the new Star Wars movies, where like the Resistance and the First Order have no context. Like we don't understand anything about the circumstances that gave rise to them. Like in the Phantom Menace and the prequels, we see that the Republic is very like moribund and incompetent and unable to deal with the crises it's facing, and as a result, the Empire came about. So there is a context to it. In the original trilogy, we see the Empire is exceedingly brutal in their effort to maintain control, and there's a counter reaction to it. But in like Darling and the Franxx, it's like, okay, so they just don't like being a human is just kind of a drag, and it's lame and it's lazy, and it could have been very easily fixed with just a little bit more context. And when we finally, so humanity is divided into kind of two parts. You have the adults who live in their cities and just coom all day. And then you have the parasites who are cloned humans that are used to pilot Franxx, because you have to have a male female pair to pilot a Franxx, and I think you have to be capable of reproduction. The pilot one, why, I'm not exactly sure. I think it has something to do with Klaxosaurs. It's not very well explained, and frankly, it doesn't really matter. That's not really one of my major issues with this. I didn't really care about how the Franks operated, but the idea is if you're able to serve long enough, you'll be able to become an adult and gain immortality and live within the like golden city where humanity was. And it kind of reminds me a bit almost of Battle Angel, where you have the city that's name escapes me, and it's kind of held as a paradise and an escape from the suffering of the world. And it kind of has, I don't know, a metaphorical and metaphysical meaning as being kind of like the mountain and the city in the sky, the thing that all humans strive for as kind of a means of salvation. But they don't really deliver on that in any meaningful way. Here, whereas in Alita it has the context of the wasteland, everything is just complete garbage, and the city is where things will actually get better. And then kind of throughout it you have Ape who's saying, oh well, we're gonna like continue to liberate humanity from their bodies even more, so humans are gonna just no longer have separate forms at all. Humans are just gonna become, I think, pure consciousness, but they don't really explain that or go into that. And you're like, why? What is the context for this? Is it because the world is destroyed to the previous experiments? So this is going to completely detach humanity from the world, and in completely detaching humanity from the world, humanity's finally going to be free from all of, like, it doesn't make sense. It's not really explained. Once again, you could kind of have had this as they're going all in because their previous attempt to save humanity or to change humanity failed. They're going to have to abandon the physical world altogether, and it could be kind of a whole sunk cost thing where, like I said, they've gone this far, they might as well go all the way, and they just keep throwing resources at this impossible pipe dream of creating a transhumanist people. But like I said, that's never really explored. You also have you have one really good episode where they get to see the inside of the city and see how the adults live, and you're finally kind of given this peek into this is what they're fighting for. This is humanity. These are the master. This is the master race, and they're all really kind of pathetic and creepy. And I would have liked to have seen some more of that. And I would have liked to maybe delve more into that. Because for the first, like, 16 episodes or whatever, the stakes are them trying to protect the remains of humanity. So I would have liked to have that maybe explored a bit more. Um, and this show is definitely trying to be philosophical and definitely trying to say something about human nature. So I don't really get why they're so like hostile to the concept of actually exploring any of these things. Like the squad, what was it, Squad 13 and Hero and Zero Two are supposed to represent kind of a throwback to humanity as it used to be, full of life, a desire to reproduce, a desire to make things with their own hands, a rejection of this just pleasure seeking passive life that doesn't accomplish anything. But once again, there's no real juxtaposition. And like it gets so bad the adults get killed off screen near the end of the series, and I didn't even notice because it's so done in complete, like, just it's not important. It's like, okay, this central idea for the series is not important. And I guess what it's supposed to be is, oh, the adults were just pawns for Verm and for this weird alien thing we're going to introduce at the last minute. But it's like there's no reason for that. This whole show should have just been about transhumanists who hate humanity, who hate emotion and love, and like I said, like sexual reproduction and discovery, and just want everyone to live in an eternal present tense. And don't think, ironically enough, their transhumanism comes from a belief that humans can't be made better. And so they want to bring evolution to an end and bring the development of humanity to an end. And that would have been a really interesting kind of plot to explore. But like I said, they opted to not do that. And some of the stuff they came about in there, like how they did try to deal with it. Like I actually found the slice of life parts of this show to be my favorite parts. I didn't really care that much for the mech battles. I'm kind of jaded when it comes to mech battles in anime, but it just that didn't interest me. A lot of the episodes where they're just like fishing or they're interacting with each other or they're having like some of the romantic tension or kind of more existentialist stuff. I like that. That was really solid. But overall, it's just they wasted a lot of time on nothing burgers. Now, to kind of compare this whole thing to Evangelion, because you might say, well, Argent, Evangelion had a lot of this stuff in it. Because you had Sele, which is basically exactly the same thing as Abe, and they had their plan to merge all of human consciousness into one super being through the Human Instrumentality Project. And that was retarded, and that was kind of like what Ape was doing. Okay, well that's fair, but here's why I'm going to disagree with that. I think Human Instrumentality, even if it was batshit crazy, had more context because the goal of the Human Instrumentality Project was to allow humans to understand each other. It was to end loneliness, and it was to end pain. And these are things that had been brought up very much throughout the series. Pretty much all the characters suffer from extreme loneliness. They're unable to reach out to each other, they're unable to communicate with one another. They're all kind of miserable, and they just, life to them has just kind of become pain and isolation and that sort of thing. And when the Human Instrumentality Project shows up, it does offer a specific solution, even if it's a fake solution, to what had been built up. But there's no context here. It's just kind of like, oh, okay, we're gonna have worms show up and they hate the physical world, and this hasn't been explained at all. And it's just kind of stuff like that. So overall, I think there's a big missed opportunity here. I think this show could have been like really, really good, but they just wasted a lot of time on random tangents and didn't really deliver on any of the stuff they said they were going to deliver on. So that's part two. Part three is just going to be me ranting about the ending and why it was such a bad idea and why it destroyed the series. Most anime endings tend to be awful, but this one was especially bad.